All right, well, hello everybody and good evening. My name is Krista. I'll be your librarian host this evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for the surprising history of American cheese. Please join me in welcoming Sarah Wassberg Johnson, also known as the food historian, beginning our talk tonight. So a couple of quick housekeeping things before we get started. First, you are muted during tonight's talk, so no mics and no cameras on, please. If you do have any questions or comments you'd like to make, please utilize the chat box below, and Sarah will do her best to answer those questions. Tonight's program is also being recorded, so if you missed something or if you want to check back later and see something you may have missed, no worries. That recording will be available through the library's YouTube page, which you can get to on our website. And I'm also going to email everybody who signed up for tonight's program a link to that video as well. So just keep an eye out for an email from me in the next couple of days or so. If you do enjoy tonight's program, you can check out the library website, POKLIB.org. You can go to our events calendar and you can see all the other programs we have coming up now through August, both in person and virtual. And speaking of August, Sarah will be back on August 24th at 6:30 p.m. to do a virtual presentation called Cooking by the Book. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to put the link to that Zoom registration in the chat in the next couple of minutes or so you can sign up there, or you can also sign up again through our events page on our website. If you have any tech issues tonight with your sound or your video quality, you can also reach out to me directly in the chat. I can try to help troubleshoot that for you because I'll be watching along with you all because I'm excited to hear about American cheese. So that's pretty much all I have going on. If you have any questions, again, just reach out to me directly in the chat. Otherwise, Sarah, take it away. Enjoy, everybody, and I'll see you at the end.
Thanks so much, Krista. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining me tonight. Just a little note, I have been talking a lot today, so hopefully I won't lose my voice as we do this talk, but if you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. So tonight's talk is the surprising history of American cheese from Monterey to Vermont and everywhere in between. And when you think of American cheese, you probably think of this, right? A slice of processed cheese individually wrapped in plastic. But the real history behind American cheese is a little bit more complicated, and the term American cheese was not always applied to this type of cheese. So cheese throughout history has been used in a lot of different ways. This is a great little Dutch still life painting, very typical from the 17th century. And you can see this is the kind of cheese that most people were eating in this time period. They're big giant wheels. These are both aged cheeses. And they were generally served as a dessert course, right, at the end of the meal. So we have it here with fruit. There's some nuts, right? We have a little wine. And it was served at the end of the meal as kind of a standalone ingredient. Excuse me. So that's generally known as the cheese course, right? We have some other types of cheeses over here. This is from Mrs. Beaton, right? And so the cheese course changes depending on where you are. The British cheese course generally comes, if I'm remembering it correctly, because now I'm blanking on it. The British cheese course generally comes after dessert, right? Because you're lingering with port after dessert. The French cheese course, I think, comes before or in lieu of dessert. And American cheese, interestingly enough, is really just cheese that was made in America for a very long time. And some of the earliest types of cheese that are made in America are actually exported to Britain. This is happening as early as the 1790s. We're exporting American-style cheddars back to Britain. Irony, because the term cheddar actually comes from Cheddar, England. And there's a whole bunch of interesting stories in early America about cheese and American presidents. So we're going to talk about some of those stories as we go along here. Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, and Mark Van Buren all have some interesting cheese stories that we're going to get to. But before we do, I wanted to talk a little bit about the cheese course, right? This is a text-based picture, essentially, of how you would set a table up for the cheese course. This is from 1845. So they have Gruyere, Roquefort, or Stilton. So Roquefort and Stilton are both kind of blue cheeses, right? Butter in forms like their perhaps their salad, like a green salad. There's cheese biscuits or shredded cucumber. And then you can have another type of cheese, either shredded or grated Parmesan or Neuchâtel cream cheese, which is not necessarily the type of cream cheese that we know it today, but a French soft cheese, right? So you have some kind of stronger tasting cheeses and some kind of milder tasting cheeses. So this is like a basic cheese course setup. This is just another image of a later in the 19th century. We're getting our cheese courses a little bit more desserty, right? So this one, there's no sweet things at all in this cheese course. This one, there's all kinds of cakes and cookies and biscuits and fruit, right? We have some sugared raspberries here. There's straight up candy. There's different kinds of grapes. And then we have a little slice of cheese here that goes with the rest of the course. American cheese tends to be a little bit different than a lot of European cheeses, and it has to do a lot with American dairy, the American dairy industry, right? So dairy cows and other traditionally dairy producing animals like, domestic sheep and domesticated goats are not native to the Americas. There was not very much, if any, dairy consumption in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. So this is very much a factor of European colonization and immigration. So the first dairy cattle arrived in the 16th century from Spain. As we get westward expansion, dairy production really increases, right? So the Northeast, New York included, New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, traditionally were wheat producing areas. They were the breadbasket of colonial America in a lot of ways. But as we start to move west, as a lot of those wheat farms kind of get played out, right? A lot of them switch to dairy production because grazing, you can graze cattle on pretty marginal land. The agricultural revolution also plays a big role in dairy production in the United States. We start to get in the 1820s, but for sure by the 1840s, people start to be interested in specific breeds of dairy cattle. It's not just any cow that you're breeding and then milking. You start to get the development of specific breeds for dairy and specific breeds for beef. And as technology advanced, it got easier and easier to ship dairy further away. So as we're urbanizing, railroads, cream cans, milk cans help farmers reach audiences, or I should say customers, beyond their immediate area. And you start to be able to have milk in urban areas without having to have your own milk cow. So these are just some examples of New York dairy farms. This is a very typical dairy farm in Pearl River, right? This is from a postcard. This is meant to be a pastoral, beautiful scene, right? There's all these dairy cows laying down in the shade in this big open field, right? Very bucolic. So let's talk a little bit about our presidential cheeses, right? There were a couple of Mammoth cheeses that are happening in the early 19th century. The Cheshire Mammoth cheese was created specifically for Thomas Jefferson's inauguration in Cheshire, Massachusetts. A Baptist pastor named John Leland was a big Thomas Jefferson booster. Supposedly the entire town of Cheshire, Massachusetts went for Jefferson, except for maybe like one person. So he decided, hey, to celebrate this victory, let's get the whole town together and we're going to make a cheese from the milk of all the dairy cows in town. So it's like 900 cows. They press it in a cider press, like a hard cider press, which is quite large. It's 4 feet across, over 1,200 pounds. And it was known as a political cheese, in part because Leland was abolitionist and he was a Federalist. Sorry, it was made without Federalist milk, sorry. and without slave labor, right? So it was said, it was right on it. It said right on it, it was a political cheese. There was a motto inscribed on it that said, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," right? All these great things. And so he sends it from Cheshire, Massachusetts, down to Washington, D.C. It leaves in the winter of 1801. They take it by sleigh to a barge on the Hudson River. It goes down to New York City on the barge, and then it is loaded on the sloop Estrella, which sails to Baltimore. It goes by wagon from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and it arrives in time for Thomas Jefferson's inauguration. And because Thomas Jefferson did not want to accept a gift because he thought, oh, maybe they're trying to, influence me politically, he paid for the cheese by giving a $200 donation to Pastor Leland's congregation back in Cheshire, Massachusetts. It stayed in the White House for 2 years. Nobody ate it for 2 years. So it was pretty aged, I think, by the end. It became this big kind of thing in the press. Thomas Kennedy wrote an ode to the Mammoth Cheese presented to Thomas Jefferson on January 1st. I'm not going to read it for you. You can look this up, but this is the kind of thing that people were doing in the time period in early America, making giant cheeses and sending them to the president. So that was not the first, or sorry, it was the first, but not the last of the Mammoth presidential cheeses. Thomas Meacham, a couple decades later, says, you know what? That was a great idea. Everybody remembers the Cheshire Mammoth cheese at Jefferson's inauguration. He was a New York State dairy farmer in upstate New York, and he was a booster for New York dairy farming. And so he thought, you know what, let's do that again, but this time for Andrew Jackson. So he made a 1,400-pound cheese plus a couple other, like 400 to 700-pound cheeses. And used the journey to Washington, D.C. as like a marketing opportunity for New York dairy and dairy farming. The cheese for Andrew Jackson arrives again, Inauguration Day, January 1st, 1836. It goes to the White House. Jackson is known as the people's president, right? So he has one last party for his presidency in 1837, and they open up the White House to people, and this cheese is part of the party, and it gets kind of infamous for a lot of reasons. This is an illustration from Curly's reminiscences of 60 years in, I think it's the capital metropolis, the national metropolis, from 1886. So this is Benjamin Curly Poor looking back on his time in Washington, D.C., and he recalls the great cheese levee. And he says, after having been exhibited at New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, it was kept for some time in the vestibule at the White House and was finally cut at an afternoon reception on the 22nd of February, 1837. For hours did a crowd of men, women, and boys hack at the cheese, many taking large chunks of it away with them. When they commenced, the cheese weighed 1,400 pounds, and only a small piece was saved for the president's use. The air was redolent with cheese, the carpet was slippery with cheese, and nothing else was talked about at Washington that day. So this becomes kind of a thing, like people are crowding into the White House. There's no security. Andrew Jackson actually like leaves through a window because there's just this crush of people. Everybody is like, taking giant chunks of this cheese. It's like free cheese as much as they can carry away. A young Mark Twain is actually in the Capitol as kind of like a cub reporter, and he writes later that like one of the greatest regrets in his life was that he did not get any of this cheese. There's a whole bunch of other scandals going on at the time, which Pearlie like continues to talk about after this quote, but he says basically everybody was totally distracted by this giant cheese. So like I said, that wasn't the only Mammoth Cheese, Martin Van Buren, when he takes over the presidency from Andrew Jackson, he had also been Andrew Jackson's vice president, basically has to completely redo that room because there's just cheese everywhere. Henrietta Nesbitt, who was the housekeeper of FDR when he was at the White House, actually made a crack that all of the rodents and other pests in the White House all stemmed back from that day of cheese. They all came from that and just never left. Martin Van Buren got his own Meach and Mammoth cheese. As the vice president, he got a 700-pound cheese. And as he took office, there was a large bank panic, right? The Panic of 1837. He did not handle the management of that panic well. It's part of the reason why he is a one-term president. And in January of 1839, really close to the White House, you know, the bank panic has been horrible. This country's basically in a recession, and a beggar freezes to death not too far from the White House. And so that like spurs Martin Van Buren into action. What does he do? He donates the 700-pound cheese that's been sitting there since he got it. He donates it to the Female Union Benevolent Society in Washington, D.C. as like, you know, use this to feed the poor, basically. You know, which was not maybe the best symbolism he could have done to help handle the Panic of 1837 and its aftermath, which is part of the reason why poor Marty did not get reelected. So those are our giant presidential cheeses. As we go through the 19th century, consumption of cheese starts to change a little bit. Cheese historically had been consumed kind of on its own, right? As a complete ingredient. You didn't really use it necessarily in cooking, but that does start to change a little bit in the 18th and early 19th century. So some recipes that actually used cheese were Welsh rarebit, which is basically melted cheese, sometimes with like dry mustard added or tomato or other things, and you serve it on toast. It's kind of similar to raclette or fondue, something like that. But people also made cheese pennies or cheese straws. So this is an example, a 20th century example of cheese straws, fancy ones. So those were served, you know, as part of the cheese course. It's basically you're making like little biscuits or crackers where part or all of the fat in the recipe uses an aged cheese like cheddar. There were cheese souffles and custards, macaroni and cheese, right? That dates back definitely to the Jefferson household. Jefferson's enslaved chef, James Hemming, basically introduced polite society in the United States to pasta, particularly macaroni and cheese. Cheesecakes made out of, you know, young cheeses like cottage cheese, farmer cheese, ricotta, things like that. And then we have American cheddar, right? We talked a little bit about American cheeses being sent over to Britain in our introduction. It was made potentially as early as the 1620s, not super clear, but definitely very early in American settlement. As soon as we got dairy cows, we were making cheddar. Also known as store cheese, yellow cheese, Yank cheddar, and apple pie cheese, which we can get into later. But American cheese, right, was the most common moniker. We talked about it was exported to Britain. The first print reference to the term American cheese comes in 1804 in Kentucky, right? So that's the first time you see that phrase in print. And here in New York, the Herkimer area was really known for a specific type of cheddar. And the first commercial factory making cheddar in New York was at Rome, New York, which is not very far from Herkimer, in 1841. And that's kind of the development of New York cheddar, which is a very sharp, aged cheddar that's pretty distinctive in American cheddar history. So what else about American cheddar? We talked a little bit about New York cheddar, right? It's very sharp. Tends to be aged a little longer than most typical cheddars. Macadam is one of the oldest and still around cheese producing companies that was started in New York in the 1870s. Vermont cheddar. You ever wondered what the difference between New York cheddar and Vermont cheddar is? Not a whole lot. Vermonters argue that their cheddar tastes sharper because of the terroir, right, of Vermont. But it is usually white and it is never orange. Historically, cheddars have been tinted orange, right? Some of them were orange because of the cheddaring process, but a lot of them were tinted orange with annatto or other natural colorings. Vermont cheddar is pretty much almost never orange. Cabot, probably the most famous of the Vermont cheese companies that's still around today. And then there's Wisconsin cheddar, which is much milder. It's usually always orange and it's not aged for as long. It tends to be softer, less crumbly, a little more moist. And Land O'Lakes, which I have a great image here, although sadly I don't think there is actually any natural cheddar cheese in this image. But Land O'Lakes is probably the most famous Wisconsin cheese company that people still know today. So let's talk about some other American cheeses. And I'm going to go kind of in chronological order here. So we talked a lot about cheddar. Monterey Jack is one of the oldest cheeses made in the United States and an original United States. Monterey Jack was developed in the United States, was first made in the 16th century in Spanish missions with Franciscan friars out in California, that area. Again, we talked about Spanish cattle were some of the first dairy cattle in the New World. In the 18th century, they started making something called queso del país, or country cheese, right? That is kind of the precursor to what we know today as Monterey Jack. There's a whole bunch of possible origin stories. The phrase jack may have came from a house jack, which is like a type of press. Some people claim, you know, like Spanish women were making it and first selling it under the Monterey Jack name. Other people claim a guy by the name of David Jack basically popularized it, right, and gave it its name. And there are a whole bunch of different varieties, including pepper jack, Colby Jack, and dry jack, which is what's pictured here. This is a more aged jack cheese. Monterey Jack tends to be very mild with relatively high fat content. If you eat a lot of Tex-Mex food, it is usually the preferred cheese in Tex-Mex, and then California Mexican food also. It has a great, you know, creamy kind of melting point and good mild flavor for those sorts of dishes. All right, another American cheese that you may have heard of is brick cheese. I couldn't find a good picture, so I used this cheese press instead. It was developed in Wisconsin by a Swiss immigrant named John Jossi. He emigrated to Dodge County, Wisconsin in 1865, started making Limburger. You know your cheeses as a popular but very smelly cheese. It's probably the smelliest of the American cheeses. And he was kind of experimenting with different ways of making it, and he kind of changed the formula a little bit, and it resulted in brick cheese, right, in the 1870s. Some people say he was looking for a new cheese. Some people say it was an accident. But basically, he creates a less smelly, kind of soft cheese. It's got kind of a similar texture to Havarti, so it's not quite like wholly like Swiss, but it looks a little bit lacy, right? It's very soft, kind of tender texture. Jossi Holdings are later acquired by Kraft, and it's called brick cheese because it's made in a brick-shaped box, and originally it was pressed with bricks, right? So it's sort of similar to cheddar, but it skips some of the cheddaring process, and the whey is pressed out with bricks, or later they developed more formal presses. The other thing that makes it a little different from cheddar is it's washed with a different bacteria. It's actually the same bacteria as Polivec. It's called Bacterium linens. And that kind of changes the makeup of the cheese and gives it sort of that lacy, not quite lacy, but that sort of, you know, not real firm, solid texture. All right. Another famous American cheese is Colby cheese, right? We talked about Colby Jack. It's a mixture of Colby cheese and Monterey Jack. It's invented in Colby, Wisconsin. The Steinwan family opened a cheese factory in the 1880s, and their son Joseph washed one batch of cheddar with cold water. And again, was he doing it on purpose? probably he was looking for new cheeses. He was kind of like a progressive guy. Some people say it was by accident, but I think it was probably on purpose. And that results in this sort of milder, softer cheese that we know today as Colby. It gets to be super popular in Wisconsin. They name it after the town. And it's easy to manufacture. It's fewer steps than the cheddar process. So it becomes popular not only for its mild taste and kind of creamy texture, but also because it's a lot easier to manufacture than cheddar. It's a lot faster process as well. So here in New York, dairying is a really big business. Wisconsin gives us a run for our money, California a little bit too, but New York tends to dominate, New York and Pennsylvania, but especially New York tends to dominate the dairy industry in the Northeast. Orange County, which is where I am located, is one of the biggest dairying counties. Herkimer County up in the Utica area being another one too. And then Cuba, New York, which is in the southern tier, kind of in the Binghamton area, is another very famous cheese making region. And in Orange County and Rockland County in particular, they are serving New York City primarily for fluid milk, right? So in this area, Borden was one of the big fluid milk distributors. They start out in Texas and are famous for their evaporated and condensed milks, but they were also fluid milk dealers, and they had a big demonstration farm up in Walk Hill, New York, the village of Walk Hill, not the town of Walk Hill, up in Ulster County. But they were the big fluid milk dealer in this area, you know, contracting with dairy farmers to provide milk for New York City. They weren't the only ones doing it, but they were the really big ones. So as we're going through the 19th century, we have a number of advances in dairying, which make it a lot easier to produce cheese commercially. One of which is mechanical milking, right? You don't have to have individual people milking cows anymore. They get mechanized milkers, right? You got the development of a bunch of machinery, including, this is a Swedish one, but I thought this is a sweet image of a cream separator, right? So that makes it easier to separate cream for butter making, things like that. You get steam cleaning, sanitation gets a lot better in the late 19th century. Trucking, so you get the delivery of milk by truck, so it's easier to deliver fresh milk. And then sanitation, like I said, not just steam cleaning and machinery and stainless steel and things like that, but also pasteurization. Pasteurization actually doesn't become super popular until the 1920s. So really until the 1920s, pasteurized milk was considered lower quality because it wasn't clean enough already, right? Everybody was drinking raw milk, including in cities until the 1920s with varying degrees of success, right? You get refrigeration, commercial refrigeration, first with natural ice packing and then later artificial refrigeration. Then we also start to get dairy cooperatives, right? Farmers are starting to work together and kind of cut out the middleman sometimes, do their own direct making of butter and cream separating and making cheese. So you get cooperative dairies, cooperative cheese factories, things like that. And then also as the century wears on into the early 20th century, we start to get the development of national standards for like butter fat content. That's when we start to get whole milk, 1%, 2% skim milk. Like, what does that mean? What's our fat content in cheese? What does it mean to be a cheddar? What does it mean to be other types of cheese? These are all happening in the 19th and early 20th century. Just a couple of pictures. I love this one because this is from 1910. This is the Trumptown Historical Society in upstate New York. And this farmer is delivering all of his milk cans or possibly cream cans to the local creamery on a sleigh, right? Because it's wintertime. So even in the 1910s, this is how people were moving fluid milk from individual dairies to creameries. All right, so we're in the 20th century. Now let's talk a little bit about how cheese cooking and eating has changed, right? We get the rise of sandwich culture. Cheese sandwiches become a big deal for picnicking and tea parties and tea rooms, things like that. We have cream cheese. They start to get grilled cheese. There's the development of pimento cheese in the South, but especially that is like a commercial. It actually starts out as a commercial cheese product, a mixture of cream cheese and jarred pimento peppers. We get cheeseburgers, right? Cheese is very popular in salads, cottage cheese in particular, and then also they're doing things like putting cottage cheese and shredded cheese in gelatin-based salads. Cheese ball garnishes, right? Toppings. They put cheese in everything: celery, tomatoes, peppers. We have cheese bread, right? Quick breads where cheese is an ingredient. Biscuits where cheese is an ingredient. Pie crust, we talked about apple pie cheese. Lots of people start to make apple pies with cheese in the crust. It's a New England thing. During, for vegetarians, and particularly during the First World War, a lot of cheese, especially cottage cheese, is touted as a meat substitute. Right, so they're doing stuff to make mock sausage, cheese patties. They're using it in casseroles, macaroni and cheese. And then cheesecake is developed in the late 19th, early 20th century. And we'll talk about the origin of that primary ingredient in a minute. Cream cheese for desserts, all kinds of fun stuff. So this is just a great image of cheese stuffed tomatoes from the Kraft Cheese Company. This cookbook is from 1942. It's from my collection. And it probably, I mean, Kraft probably put out this cookbook in 1942 in part to be like, hey, you should eat cheese for the war effort. But also this would have been a good meat substitute. This is another great image. We still have our cheese course as late as the 1940s, but it looks a little bit different. So there's this cheese board with all different types of cheeses. This is a cream cheese, blue cheese. This is like Edam. Swiss cheese, we have like a brie looking kind of aged cheese, and then these are crackers, and it was served with tea or coffee then at the end of the meal, right? So we talked about cheesecake and cream cheese. Let's talk about Philadelphia cream cheese. Fun fact, Philadelphia cream cheese is not from Philadelphia. It was actually developed right here in Orange County, New York, down in Chester, New York. In the 1870s, he was trying to make Neufchâtel, the French style soft cheese, and he put a bunch of cream in one batch and ended up with essentially cream cheese, right? In 1880, they rebranded it Philadelphia because at the time Philadelphia was like famous for purity and wholesomeness. I don't know why, but that was a thing that was happening at the time, so they made that like their brand name. And it became crazy popular. In 1828, they were acquired by Kraft Phoenix, who I'll get to in a bit. You'll see a lot of Kraft images here because it just had great illustrations. Liederkranz is another Orange County developed cheese developed by this guy, Emil Frey, who worked for the Monroe Cheese Company in Monroe, New York, just down the road from Chester. In 1889, one of the co-owners of the Monroe Cheese Company was also a deli owner in New York City, a German deli owner. And his customers really loved Bismarck cheese, which is a German style cheese, like a soft kind of stinky cheese. And he tried to import it from Germany, and it always ended up being spoiled by the time it got there. So he said, hey, see if you can make Bismarck cheese here in the US. So Emil Frey is from Switzerland, and he develops what becomes known as Liederkranz. Also, it's like a deodorized Limburger. Again, you know, kind of a soft, strong tasting cheese, but not nearly as smelly. You see some stuff like, oh, your wife will like it. So it's like acceptable for you to eat. It's named after the Liederkranz Choir in New York City. And the Monroe Cheese Company is acquired by Borden in 1929. Emil Frey continues to work for Borden until his retirement in 1938. But that's not the only thing he invents. He also invents pita. Again, also invented in Monroe, New York. Again, he's put to the challenge. The company makes giant wheels of Swiss, but some of them in the course of aging or in the process of making them, the wheels crack, right? You can't sell cracked wheels of cheese, and they're like do something with all these cracked wheels of cheese. This is a waste. What can we do with this? So Emil Frey decides that I'm going to try and melt it down, right? I'm going to take all these broken wheels of Swiss, melt it down, maybe mix some other dairy stuff into it, and ends up with a velvety soft cheese product, because it's not technically a natural aged cheese. This is in 1918, and they call it Velveeta, right? They rebrand the Monroe Cheese Company in 1923 as the Velveeta Cheese Company. It kind of breaks off into its own thing. And in 1927, it's acquired by Kraft. Remember that 1918 thing. So Emil Frey develops this independently, right? So let's talk about Kraft. James L. Kraft. Here's James L. Kraft right here. James L. Kraft was an Ontario dairy farmer. And in 1893, he goes to the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He wants to see the dairy exhibitions and kind of see what's going on. And he's really interested in cheese. And he goes to like the cheese display, right? People are sending cheeses from all over the place. And he's got this kind of very famous quote about cheese at the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. He says, no matter how wholesome it was when it left the manufacturer, it often reached the market in a state of extinct virtue. Right? So a lot of cheeses, if they're not kept cool, if they're not refrigerated, they're going to go bad if they're just like sitting out on a table with their little label next to them, you know, as thousands of people are coming in and out of this unrefrigerated, air conditioned building. They're not going to be great at the end of the World's Fair. They're certainly not going to be, they're probably not great, as he says, when they got there. So he kind of makes it his life's mission to figure out how can we make cheese last longer and be more shelf stable. He gets in the cheese retailing business in the early 20th century in Buffalo, New York, in Chicago. He has some early partners who are not great. He kind of strikes out on his own. And by 1912, they've got headquarters in New York City. They're based in Chicago, but they have headquarters in New York City because they're doing so well. By 1914, they are retailing 31 varieties of cheese. Kraft continues his quest to try and figure out ways to make cheese last longer. And in 1916, he applies for a patent for what he calls processed cheese, right? You'll notice that 1916, he gets the patent, and in 1918, Emil Frey invents Velveeta. Kraft is very much defends his patent. I don't know why he doesn't go after Velveeta. Maybe he doesn't think it's a patent infringement or just decides to buy it instead. But yeah, he's the first person to patent the processed cheese food, I guess, because again, it's like a melted cheese. It's not a real aged cheese. So that turns out to be a great idea because in 1917, the United States enters the First World War and purchases 25 million tins of Kraft processed cheese for military use, right? So already right away, he's got this huge government contract. The government also contracted with Pabst, which we'll get into in a little bit. But this is a big boost for his company. They rebrand in 24 as the Kraft Cheese Company. Again, they purchased Velveeta in 27. Philadelphia Cream Cheese in 28. They had merged with another dairy cheese company called Phoenix, so they became Kraft Phoenix. 1937, they invent Kraft Dinner, right? During the Great Depression, one of their St. Louis salesmen had the idea of, hey, let me make these little packets of grated cheese and rubber band them to a box of pasta and advertise, hey, you can make macaroni and cheese. And James L. Kraft thought that was a fabulous idea, and they ended up developing Kraft Dinner or Kraft macaroni and cheese out of that concept. 1950, they have Kraft Singles, right? That very first slide, the individually wrapped slices of American cheese. 1952-53, they invent Cheese Whiz as an alternative to Welsh Rarebit. Actually, they're going back to like the roots of cheese consumption in America. And then these are just some examples of all the different products they made. They did for a very long time make natural cheese. You may be, if you're maybe older and your parents did fancy dinner parties, you might have recognized some of these like Rocca blue cheese and Old English. cheese, right? These processed cheese spreads that people would put like in celery and stuff like that. Yeah, they've got Belvedere, Philadelphia cream cheese, Kraft dinner, all kinds of fun stuff. Yeah, this is the Cheese Whiz for fast cheese treats, right? It's literally a room temperature processed shelf stable Welsh rarebit. So you can put it on hot foods, you can heat it up and pour it on things, you can put it on toast, you can put it on vegetables, all kinds of fun stuff. The can comes later. All right, so I talked about Pabst. The heck is Pabst Beer Company doing in a talk on cheese? Well, they were thinking ahead about Prohibition, right? So it's the 19-teens. Everybody knows Prohibition is coming. People are very temperance driven in the United States at this time. And the Pabst family already owned a bunch of dairy cattle. So they said, all right, how can we weather a ban on our primary product of alcohol? Well, let's try and make some cheese. So they developed Pabst-et, which is again a processed cheese product. They're using all of their stainless steel equipment that they use to make beer, combined with the dairy cattle, they're using that to process cheese. They have a bunch of different flavors, including brick and Swiss. 1927, Kraft sued them for patent infringement. I don't know why they took so long, but they did. And then the apocryphal story is they came to some kind of agreement that Pabst could continue producing cheese as long as there was Prohibition. So when Prohibition ends in 1933, they sell Pabst-et to Kraft. It continues to be produced under that name for a short period of time, but then it pretty much disappears. So Kraft buys the company basically to put them out of business. This is another example. Again, very similar to Velveeta, right? You get the giant brick, or it comes in these little cans. So as we've already talked about, World War I had a big influence on our processed cheese development, right? But it also had a big impact on how people consumed cheese. Rationing was voluntary during World War I, but Meatless Monday comes right out of World War I. People were encouraged to eat a lot less meat and fat. And we had a big fluid milk surplus. Dairy prices were kind of all over the place at the time, but they were pretty high for consumers. So we had a surplus of fluid milk. Most of the condensed milk companies had already absorbed as much milk as they could. So the federal government got involved in milk boosterism, particularly in 1918. And they encouraged people to eat a lot more milk, a lot more cheese. They were, were in the early stages of nutrition science. So they're saying, hey, a pound of cottage cheese has as much or more protein than a pound of any kind of meat you can eat, right? So they're trying to get people to eat up all this milk. This is a cartoon from 1919, but it's depicting the issue around milk production. It's maybe a little convoluted, but here's the farmer in the grip of the fat cat fluid milk dealer, right? And there's New York dairy herds are back here. And the farmer says, living wages are all I ask. And the fluid milk dealer says, he won't sell me the milk below the cost of production, so I'll kill the cow, right? So you're gonna reduce production to drive up the price. And this is John Q. Public. And he says, but how about my milk, right? And there's these shackles that say less than cost paid to farmers and high prices to you. So this is actually published by the New York Dairymen's League to kind of drum up public support for their plight, which is that their costs were going up, but the price they were getting from fluid milk dealers was not going up or was sometimes going down. And the cost to consumers was going way up for a variety of reasons, including, shipping and labor shortages and things like that. But it's this whole big complicated thing that doesn't really have any real resolution. But this is all the stuff that's going on during World War I, during and after World War I, that people were trying to convince people to eat up this fluid milk surplus. Similar things happening in the 20th century with milk surpluses in the last couple of years, people dumping milk because they can't get a good price for it. So dairy industry in many ways hasn't changed a whole lot. So we talked about cottage cheese, right? Cottage cheese is very specifically American. There are other kinds of young cheeses that you see elsewhere, like in Europe, like ricotta and mascarpone, and feta is a pretty young cheese. Goat cheeses are pretty young. I call them young cheeses because they're not aged very much, right? So cottage cheese, ancient origins. Here in the United States, it's usually dressed with cream, right, to make it extra creamy. It starts to get popular in the 19th century in the United States, super popular in the first couple decades of the 20th century as a meat substitute. This is the, more 1 pound of cottage cheese supplies more protein than all of these meat animals, right? That happens again in World War II. And then post-war, because it's high in protein and relatively low in fat, it becomes kind of this hallmark of dieting, which is I think why a lot of modern Americans hate cottage cheese, because they associate it with dieting. All right, moving through the 20th century, we have a couple other developments of American style cheeses. This Maytag blue cheese, this is gorgonzola. I couldn't find a good image of Maytag blue. In the 30s, the University of Iowa develops blue cheese from cow's milk, and it's homogenized milk. They were trying to replicate Roquefort, which was very popular in the mid 20th century in the United States. Maytag dairy farms were founded in 1941, basically coming out of this research from the University of Iowa. And they are making the first commercial blue cheeses in 1941. During World War II, the University of Iowa patents this process. And they try to go after Danish blue cheese producers, because they say that Danish blue cheese producers are also using homogenized milk. And University of Iowa is like, you can't do that, we patented it. And the Danes are like, yeah, here's all the evidence that we were doing that before you. So they're not successful in their patent infringement lawsuit. But Maytag Dairy Farms is still around, and they're still producing this kind of famous Maytag blue cheese. World War II, we have our first federal food guidelines, which are very rooted in European and Yankee American foodways. You'll see that butter and fortified margarine is an entire food group, and milk and milk products is another entire food group. So we have mandatory rationing during World War II, including pretty tight rationing of meat and animal fats. Cheese and butter is pretty tightly rationed. Cheese is not as tightly rationed, especially not young cheeses, unaged cheeses like cottage cheese, and fluid milk is not rationed. So those are kind of touted as protein-rich meat substitutes. This is a ration coupon for meat. It does say cheeses on here, but that's probably referring to aged cheeses. The ration system was super complicated during World War II. Even people in the period struggled with it. It changed often. So it's very kind of complicated and hard to understand. But it did mean that cheese consumption kind of went up, right? Post-war changes in eating. Krista probably recognizes this picture from my talk on fast food. But people kind of go crazy, right? We don't have, as ration restrictions are lifted, there's rising prosperity as American manufacturing ramps up to basically rebuild the rest of the world. People are bringing home, GIs are bringing home interest in French and Polynesian and Japanese cuisines. We have the rise of immigrant foodways like Italian, Tex-Mex, and Chinese. And we get the prevalence of fast food, right? Most fast food starts in the 20s and 30s, but really post-World War II, more and more people are getting cars. More and more people have disposable income. Fast food becomes increasingly popular. And then also we get standardized school lunch. That was part of the war effort, was to get hot school lunches in schools. And as our farmers are dealing with the aftermath of World War II and, European and Russian farmers like starting to produce their own crops, all of a sudden we have an agricultural surplus. Well, guess what? A lot of that gets absorbed by our school system. We also start to get some concern about corporate processed foods versus natural foods, right? It's these little hints of it are starting in the 30s and 40s, and for sure by the end of the war, people are starting to be more critical. People are interested in French food. This is another local one. This is from the Tappan Library. from the 67, sorry, not the 70s, from the 60s. They're doing a little talk on French wines and cheese, and they're having like a little wine and cheese tasting to go with all of these books that are being published, which I think is super cute. So our eating habits are changing a little bit. We still have cheese sandwiches, but deli sandwiches are becoming more popular. Cheeseburgers are becoming more popular. We get my personal favorite, the bacon, egg, and cheese, right in New York, becomes super popular. We still have cheese as a garnish, but we're using it more on hot foods in addition to salads. Cheese dips, right? Like the 1960s and 70s were all about the party dips. We get beer cheese. Fondue becomes super popular. Tex-Mex gives us nacho cheese and queso. We have a ton of cream cheese, face dips, you know, like spinach artichoke and crab dip and all those fun things. Cheese appetizers, fried mozzarella sticks. Baked brie becomes a really big thing in the 80s and early 90s. Macaroni and cheese, who doesn't love mac and cheese? Italian, American food starts, you know, to be popular really in the 1890s, but for sure by the second half of the 20th century, Italian food explodes in popularity. Pizza, cheese all over that, garlic bread with cheese, pasta with cheese. Again, Tex-Mex, tons of cheese there. Great image of a fondue pot from the 70s. I totally had one when I was growing up, but not an electric one. It was a little candle one. It was for chocolate, not cheese. But in the 1970s, we started to get really interested in like European peasant food, and kind of Swiss alpine foods are one of the things that get popular, and fondue is a part of that. Charcuterie, right? The cheese tray. We don't really have a cheese course, except for in some very fancy restaurants by the time we get to the 1960s, but people are doing way more home entertaining, and everybody loves cheese. So a cheese tray is a great way to kind of round out your buffet. Fondue, like I said, becomes super popular in the 70s. In the 80s, it's all about French cheeses and showing how wealthy and sophisticated you are. By the 90s, we're really interested in Italian peasant cuisines. So people start to get interested in like Parmesan and Pecorino and Asiago, those sorts of more interesting aged peasant cuisines or peasant cheeses. And then of course, Southwest is like, it's not even like Tex-Mex, it's Southwest. So you get like, you know, Southwest tortilla roll-ups where it's like cream cheese and salsa, right? So stuff like that. In the 2000s, it's all about the wine and cheese tastings, wine pairings, all that fun stuff. Charcuterie has a huge revival in the 2010s, and which continues into the 2020s. And so what's the future of cheese, right? We've been all about the dairy for this, pretty much this whole talk. But I found this interesting cookbook. This cheese is nuts, right? Delicious vegan cheese at home. So is vegan cheese the future? We've got a dairy surplus. People are eating more and more plant-based milk, right? Is the future we're going to have hyper-local heirloom cheeses? I do a cheese tasting cruise on a boat, and we, you know, eat only Hudson Valley, New York cheeses. So that's kind of my question for the future. We talked a lot about the past. What's the future look like? We don't know. I love cheese. I think cheese is going to stick around, particularly in the United States, but that's my talk. So, any questions? I see there's some in the chat. Oh my gosh, there's like a ton in the chat. All right, I'm going to scroll back to the beginning. Karen doesn't like salty American cheese. It's true. Monterey Jack is delicious. Oh, B. Nemo, what is this a recipe for? I don't remember what recipe is in there. I have to go back and look.
I think it was for the like the image. Fondue. It looked like, yeah, like cheese cupcakes or like fondue. Huh. It was back, you know, middle of the slides.
Yes, the cream in cottage cheese is literally cream. So like the same stuff you make whipped cream out of, except for they put salt in it. So it's just to make it extra creamy. Yeah, live culture cottage cheese. Yep. Dry cottage cheese. Yeah, so it's hard to find in the United States in a lot of places now, depending on where you live. Dry cottage cheese is basically a cottage cheese that has had all of the land out of it, right? And it's not dressed with cream. Farmer cheese is kind of like slightly more moist than that, but still not dressed with cream, usually pretty fine textured. So there's different curd sizes, right? It's all standardized, but it's basically all unaged cheese. It's either curdled with bacteria, or historically, a lot of cheese was made, I didn't even go into this, with rennet, which is the lining of a calf's stomach. So when we had a very large veal industry, right, which is the consequence of the dairy industry, dairy cows produce milk because they get pregnant. You can't choose what the gender of the baby cow is. So the baby boy cows, because they're dairy cow breeds, would go to veal. Baby girl cows would grow up to get pregnant and make milk. So there was because of the veal industry, there was a large supply of natural rennet. A guy by the name of Christian Hansen, a Danish immigrant to the United States, developed an artificial rennet in the late 19th century. That became Christian Hansen Laboratories in Little Falls, New York, which again, very close to Herkimer, Utica, Rome area. And they became the people who made junket, right? So if you've ever had junket, that's artificial rennet. And most cheese today is used with artificial rennet, so it doesn't contain baby cow stomach lining in it. So that's your little history lesson that I didn't put in here. All right, Karen is also asking, do countries other than the US and the UK eat much cheese? What kind? The French are obsessed with cheese, right? They probably eat more cheese than just about anybody else on the planet. Most of Northern Europe and most of Southern Europe really is consuming cheese. The Mediterranean, Eastern Europe, the Caucasus Mountains are all like cheese consuming countries. The rest of the world, not so much, which is part of the reason why a lot of food recommendations from the government that recommend you consume dairy are considered racist, because they are not taking into consideration the food ways of people who are not Europeans, right? So not a lot of cheese consumption outside of Europe and the Mediterranean and the United States, obviously. Okay. Karen likes pineapple flavored cottage cheese. Yeah, I'm not a big fan of the sweet cottage cheese. I like the more savory stuff. But I love cottage cheese. I put it on vegetables. I'll mix it with ranch dressing and eat it as a dip. Like, I think it's great. But I get the texture thing is off-putting for some people. Anyway, I think I got through all the questions. Does anybody else have any other questions? Can maybe let people unmute if they want to, Krista.
Sure, if you have any questions, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you individually if you like.
That works for me. I can ask you guys a question if you have a favorite type of cheese. My personal favorite is sharp cheddar. Not too sharp. Like, I don't like the crumbly, crystallized, super aged cheddar, but I like the real sharp, tangy cheddars. Those are my favorite. Ooh, Krista loves Irish cheddar. Sharon says Mimolette. Yes, it's not that super orange one. Yep, Karen likes brie. I can't have brie, sadly. I'm allergic. Tanya likes the Munster. Yes, we didn't talk about that. Beanie likes Monterey Jack. Lee also likes goat cheese. That's my husband's favorite. Great, super fun. Wow, it's not even 8 o'clock yet, you guys. I did so well. I thought I was going over. Any other questions for me?
Yeah, last chance for questions. If you do want to speak your question, I can definitely unmute you. You just got to raise your hand in the participants window, and I can do that easily. And again, this is recorded, so if you want to go back and look at some of the cool images that Sarah had in there, you definitely can. Again, I'll have this out probably early next week in video form.
Yeah, and if you're like me and you always think of your question after the talk is done, my contact information is on here. You can email me. I'll just put it in the chat. Sarah at thefoodhistorian.com.
Like Dominique has a question, so you should be able to unmute yourself, Dominique.
Hi. Yes. How about cheesecakes? Did you talk about that at all?
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I forgot to talk about cheesecakes. Yeah, so cheesecakes. are ancient, right? They date back to Roman times, but the cream cheese based cheesecakes were apocryphally invented in New York City, right? And it's probably because they had all that access to the Philadelphia cream cheese coming out of Monroe, right, in the 1870s. So that's a late 19th century invention, the cream cheese based cheesecake, the New York style cheesecake that we all kind of associate today. Most of the other cheesecakes that were made prior to the development of what we know as cream cheese were made with like ricotta or mascarpone or similar like unaged soft cheeses that were not as smooth as cream cheese. So yep, that New York style cheesecake. Oh my gosh, my mouth is not cooperating. New York style cheesecake is the late 19th, early 20th century invention. Almost certainly directly related to the development of cream cheese in Orange County in the 1870s. So, great question. Thank you for making me follow up because I forget sometimes. Anybody else in the chat? Oh yeah, feta is my other favorite. Yeah, feta dill salad dressing. That sounds great. Yeah, Karen mentions Juniors. Yep, they're definitely the cheesecake masters in New York City. Okay. Any other last questions?
Last call for questions. But again, if you think of anything else after, definitely reach out to Sarah. I'm sure she would love to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Sarah. Looks like that's it for questions tonight, but we'll see you again on August 24th. I'll throw that back in the chat again. So again,
yeah, if you like cookbooks, we're going to talk about cookbooks in the US. It's going to be great.
And yeah, so register for that, or also check out the library website again. We got lots of cool programs coming up this summer and the fall and forever and ever and ever. We always have cool stuff coming up. So thanks again, everybody. Have a good night. See you later, Sarah.
Yep, we'll see you next time.
Look out for an email from me in the next couple of days with our recording. So have a good night.
Great. Bye.